Hi, everyone. My name's Haley Conway, and thank you for sitting down and spending some time to listen to my presentation for my unit plan. Ultimately, my unit plan is focused on polyrhythms and how they're used in West African music. Um, the general idea with this unit is, when I wanted to start planning it, is that I wanted to find something that I could direct a little bit more toward my older students, because I feel like as a teacher I have a hard time finding a lot of engaging, uh, fun, interactive things for my older kids compared to my younger kids. So, and then I wanted to find a unit that would incorporate a class set of drums that we have that travel from building to building in our district. So that ultimately made me come up with the unit of polyrhythms in West African music, and I'll explain a little bit more in this presentation of why these specific topics. But let's just continue on to our next part, which is the research questions. So, knowing that I wanted to do polyrhythms in West African music, I one of the first questions I thought of was what cultures primarily use polyrhythms, and I guess this was a question before I really chose West Africa as my focus, but I was really interested to see what cultures around the world um, really use polyrhythms in the music that they have. I understand that probably a lot of cultures all over the world use probably some form of polyrhythms, but I wanted to see if I could find cultures that you really use polyrhythms to start my research on. This question then helps me lead into what music styles use polyrhythms in West Africa, what parts of their music really incorporate them, and which kind of goes into what parts of West Africa, what groups of people or cultures of people use polyrhythms. So hopefully from going from Africa to West Africa, and then finding parts of West Africa that use polyrhythms. And then when I find more of those focused areas, I'm wanting to have the question of what history and background does the music have in these cultures? So, um, what music in these cultures have polyrhythms? And then, why these pieces? What's the history of these pieces? Kind of the background and the why, why they are used. So that's ultimately some of the couple questions that I have. And then this kind of leads me into kind of back to the first question, but what genres of music use polyrhythms? So this is also probably one of my earlier set questions that I had. So not necessarily fully directed toward West African music, but just around the world. Um, what genres of music do we come by that already use polyrhythms? And then with any culture that we teach, one of the main questions I also had was how we perform this authentically. How do we be true to the culture and be respectful to the culture? And what resources would I need to help show authentic representation of this music? My next few questions kind of go into more of the teacher instruction side of how to go about my research. So my first question for that was, what is the process and how to get my students comfortable with polyrhythms? And this is actually a question for how do I do it for my students, but how do I teach myself? Part of the reason why I chose the topic of polyrhythms is that I feel as a teacher, I am not very good myself with polyrhythms, especially when we've done activities of clap one rhythm in one hand, and then in your other hand, clap a completely different set of rhythms. And for me, that kind of frazzles my own mind. So I know if I'm getting frustrated with how to learn different techniques like that my students would easily. So I wanted to figure out a process and how to get my students introduced and comfortable with polyrhythms without getting too overwhelmed is one of my goals with this unit. And then my next question is kind of a question before the last question, but it's what should students be able to do before polyrhythms are introduced? So my idea with that question was, what is the musical foundation that students need to have before I even start introducing polyrhythms to them? Is it steady beat? Is it rhythms? Is it maybe instrument techniques? But what are some of those foundation concepts that I would need my students to know before I even start this? With instruments, I have the question of what good world drumming programs can I get experience and training? Because ultimately, as a teacher, if we can get hands-on experience with experts of that field or that style of music or anything, that's going to be one of the best ways we learn. So that was one of my questions. And then also along with instruments, is what instruments and playing techniques will be needed to learn for West African instruments. So for me, it's going to be researching the West African instruments that are usually used in these ensembles. What instruments will I already have with the traveling set of drums that I want to pair this unit up with? What instruments would I need to look for? What instruments would need to be good substitute for ones that I don't have? And then along with just knowing what instruments I would need is how to play those instruments correctly in the style that is needed. So this leads into some of the resources that I've found, and I have a lot of resources here, so very broadly, I found a lot of metronome-like resources that are focused with polyrhythms and being able to isolate different rhythms. Some of them are just straight click kind of metronomes, and then I found other resources that have actual instruments from West Africa and them playing, and then you can use the little dials to isolate instruments or to highlight different parts. But I found a lot of metronome-like ones. I also found a few resources from the In Tune magazines and the teaching music magazines we get from NAFME. I kind of looked through some of my own collection of those, and I found a couple resources that relate about cultural aspects of teaching cultural music and some drumming and West African resources. And then I actually did find from one of the In Tune magazines one specifically talking about polyrhythms. So that was a cool source to find. So those were some of the other resources I found. And then a book resource that I'm so far using is The Worlds of Music, an introduction to the music of world's people. So it's one of those books that Dr. Gergel had had during our on-campus class time. So I'm looking through that because it has a whole section about African music, and within there they have a lot of polyrhythm information and music background, and then just cultural background as well. So that's very briefly some of the resources I have found so far. I know I also want to find authentic YouTube videos and recordings and such to also enhance my unit also. So those are some things I'm still looking for, but this is what I have found so far. My overall timeline for this unit, like I said earlier, would be directed toward my older students. So I'm thinking 5th, 6th grade. And then because I'm wanting to direct this with a class set of drums that travel from building to building in our district. And when they're at each building, they're about 4 to 5 weeks at the buildings. So I'm planning my unit to be about 4 weeks. With one of my buildings that I'm focusing on tailoring this to, I am looking at that I would see my students 2 times a week for 45-minute class periods. So this would give me about 8 lessons or so to focus this whole unit on. I plan to do this unit about early April to early May. I like the idea of doing this unit near the end of the year so that I could use the front portion of the year to hopefully help set up any foundational rhythm or steady beat or anything that I would need to do to prepare them for this unit. Through this unit early on, I would want to go through introducing the music and culture, also reviewing drumming techniques that I would need my students to know how to play, and just general ensemble playing. I would focus on the type of music that uses polyrhythms after we get some of the foundational stuff secure. I would use times in our unit to look at the West African instruments and incorporating the purpose and the meaning of those instruments with the polyrhythms in a variety of ways. And then my ultimate goal by the end of this unit, I would want my students to be able to compose in their own groups, small groups, using the knowledge that we learned throughout the unit. So expected outcomes of this unit is I would want them to listen to and engage with West African music and polyrhythms. I would want them to learn about West African customs and the culture. I would want them to perform polyrhythms in a variety of patterns, such as 2 verse 3, 3 verse 4. There's a lot of other combinations of them, so at least showing them the primary, probably types of patterns they would see within this culture, but also probably exposing them to other combinations of polyrhythms they could encounter. I talked a lot about how to use and learn about West African instruments, so that would be part of their outcome. And then by the end of the unit, I would really want them to be able to compose and perform their own arrangements using polyrhythms. So taking everything that they learned throughout the unit and making a performance from what they know. After this unit, I was trying to think of how to connect this to other things, and one thing I thought was using the connection of polyrhythms and heading into maybe to the Caribbean style of music, because that was also another location I saw in my early research of where polyrhythms really occur. So I think that would be a cool way to kind of connect and maybe compare different cultures. And then another way that I thought about for this unit is using what they know from polyrhythms, finding music that students rarely listen to show them where polyrhythms also occur. So in some of my brief readings, that's been jazz. I have a couple resources for pop music, things like that, to hopefully make a little bit more of a connection of the concept. So that basically is my presentation of polyrhythms and West African music. Thank you for sitting down and listening to my presentation, and have a great day.